Author Series, presented by American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, in partnership with the State Library of Massachusetts. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, looking particularly at the city of Boston through time. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event featuring Boston archaeologist and author Joseph M. Bagley and his recently published work, Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them. Following his presentation, Joe will be in dialogue with NEHGS curator Kurt DiCamillo. We'll share these gents' credentials in just a moment. For now, some housekeeping items. We're in a Zoom webinar format, which means your microphone is muted and your video is off. While we cannot take your comments in the chat box, we will share some relevant links there. We do want to hear from you though. We asked for your questions as you registered. We got many of them. Thank you so much. If you have additional questions, please enter them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to slip in a few more. Tonight's program is being recorded by my colleagues here at the Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be published in the days ahead on the American Inspiration website, as well as on our education pages. We'll share that link in the chat and Zoom email it to you when the video is posted and ready for your viewing. Copies of tonight's featured book can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. You'll see on the screen the coupon code AMINSP20, which is also being placed in the chat. Do write it down. If you use the code as you order online, they'll waive the shipping fee for media mail. Even better, use the code and the book you receive will be signed by the author. No book plates this time. As Joe is local, you'll get an actual signature on the page. Even better, he's agreed to personalize books. If there's a special name you'd like there, please put it into the comment box. And lucky for us, Joe has said he can add something simple next to that name, like Happy Father's Day, or congratulations to the graduate, or thank you, or happy birthday. If you'd like this personalization, again, look for the order comments box at the bottom of the order page. Put your few words there, and Joe and the bookstore staff will get right on it, and the books will be mailed out the week of June 14. This richly illustrated guide to Boston's oldest buildings is the perfect gift for those who love travel, who love history, who love city touring, if only from their armchair. I'm Margaret Talcott, the producer of literary programs at American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society, and part of its Brew Family Learning Center. Again, we welcome you this evening. Moving quickly to start, I wanted to share some background on tonight's presenters. Our featured author, Joseph M. Bagley, is the city archaeologist of Boston, an historic preservationist, and a staff member at the Boston Landmarks Commission. He's worked previously for the Massachusetts Historical Commission and for Maine's Historic Preservation Commission. In 2016, Joe published his first award-winning book, A History of Boston in 50 Artifacts. Tonight's featured work was published just a few weeks ago, and already it's the talk of the town here in Boston. It's also the winner of the 2020 Preservation Achievement Award from the Boston Preservation Alliance. Congratulations, Joe. And now for more on our moderator, I want to hand you over to my presenter, Beth, at the State Library. Beth, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. This will be a very quick hello from the State Library of Massachusetts in the Massachusetts State House, where I am the head of special collections. One of the things we've been really happy about during this pandemic is that we've been able to collaborate with all new institutions in the Boston area and to expand our programming. So especially with people like the American Ancestors, New England Historic Genealogical Society. We're very glad to be here tonight for this virtual discussion of Joe Bagley's new book, since his topic is so well reflected in our own holdings. We hosted his first book talk, or a talk for his first book over 5 years ago. So after some opening remarks, Joe will be in conversation tonight with Kurt DiCamillo, who is the curator of special collections at New England Historic Genealogical Society. Before he joined the staff there, Kurt worked for the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and at the National Trust for Scotland. And as many of you know, Kurt is a recognized authority on the British country house. He also leads heritage tours abroad and this year in the United States. So we will hear more from Kurt shortly. So we're all going to learn a lot tonight. Those of us who are here working or living in the Boston area, and those that we hope will be inspired to visit us soon. So Joseph Bagley is the perfect author to inspire us. So Joe, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm astonished at the number of people I'm seeing at the bottom of the screen who are coming this evening. Thank you all for joining. I'll be back briefly with my video. I just got to get my screen up and running. Bear with me one more second. There we go. All right. Okay, there we go. So everyone, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. As everyone has said, this is my second book. It stands out on the crowded shelves of Boston history books by its white cover. That looks a lot like my previous book. And I wanted to begin tonight first by thanking everybody who's hosting tonight. I'm just shocked at the turnout and how well this has been advertised. So thank you for that. I also want to thank the Brandeis University Press, our publisher, especially Sue Raymond, the president, and Lillian Dunnage, the press coordinator, the many editors that worked on this book, and my beta readers, Jennifer, Jean, and Lori, who worked tirelessly on this book, and frankly, a longer version of the book that didn't see the final print, who did extra work because of that. I'm really proud of the way the book came out. It's really a fantastically designed book, which I take no credit for, from the publishers, the weight and the quality of the printing. And I'm also really grateful to the many, many photographers throughout Boston history who took fantastic photographs of the old buildings of Boston, who made my job significantly easier, especially since this was essentially my COVID project that I worked on from March and April of last year with a looming deadline. That the shutdown really gave me the opportunity to focus on getting this work done on deadline, and so it's here today. The book has four main goals, and I've structured my talk tonight, my brief talk tonight, kind of through those four lenses of fundraising, education, preparing, and to tell a good story. I'm a member of the Boston Landmarks Commission, or I'm a staff of the Boston Landmarks Commission, who's directed by Roseanne Foley, our executive director, and I work with a team of amazing historic preservationists who work every day to preserve and protect the historic places of Boston. As a city employee, I'm not allowed to moonlight, so I was able to work on the book during my normal business hours, but I'm not able to take in the funds from the book. So any of the author proceeds will be turned over to the Landmarks Commission, who will use the fundings for our outreach and engagement activities. So know that I'm not benefiting personally from the sales of this book. As part of the education component of this book, I go into a lot of details in the book about how we do landmark law, and I don't want to get into the details of and nuances of law, but I want to begin by doing a comparison between the National Register and local landmark designations, because it's really important to the historic preservation of anywhere in this country. So the National Register is a national list of historic places that are significant to the history of a local, state, or national building or structure or landscape. But essentially, the National Register is an honorific title. It's something that can provide some protections, but doesn't inherently protect a building if it's on the National Register. It still can be demolished. It can be changed in any way, unless that change is being triggered by a federal project or funding. Then there's no inherent protections to a National Register listing. Whereas a local landmark, in this case a Boston landmark, is a municipal designation that really has teeth, and that means that the changes that happen to historic structures can be regulated and can be enforced so that the buildings that are landmark designated, whether it be a district or an individual building, really can have protections placed upon them that will allow it to be restored back to its original appearance or to a significant appearance, maintained, and ultimately not demolished, because a lot of the changes to these buildings can be undone. So really fundamentally relies on these buildings sticking around and overall getting reviewed. So one of my arguments in this book is that landmark designation is really the most important thing that can be done to a building to preserve it in Boston. one of our high challenges in Boston is that we require an above local significance, which means the building or the property has to be significant at the state or federal level. It can't just be significant to the city of Boston itself. It's something we would love to change because it's a really high bar that's been set for landmark designation. National Register, you can have a National Register listed property on a local significance, but in Boston, we need to have an above local significance. And that's a challenge that maybe someday can change. But it does mean that some buildings do not pass that bar and end up ultimately preserved. So I'm going to finish the rest of the talk. It sounds like I'm wrapping up already, but we're just getting going with a discussion of some of the stories that are in the book. And I'm an archaeologist, and archaeologists are fundamentally storytellers. So what I really want to do in this book is to tell a good story about each of these homes. So tonight I'm going to talk about some of the themes that came up during the writing of this work and the interesting stories that they reveal. Of course, the book includes many more stories and details and images than I can share tonight, but I hope this will be enough to encourage you to find a copy of the book and see some of the additional details that I provide. And of course, a lot of the buildings that didn't make the cut tonight because we could only talk about so many. So of course, one of the major themes of this book is oldness. So I felt it was only appropriate to start the presentation of the individual properties with the oldest building in the book, the James Blake House, built in 1661 and located in the neighborhood of Dorchester, which was at the time its own neighborhood, its own town. So James Blake House is Boston's oldest building, and for much of its life functioned as a family home for the Blake family, a Dorchester family who arrived in the 1630s. It stands within Richardson Park near Edward Square in the northern end of Dorchester, once its own independent town. Its stark and boxy rectangular form, its steep roof, and park surroundings stand out in contrast to the captive audience of 19th century three-deckers and apartments and buildings that surround it. You can see those in the background of this photo. Long before it arrived in its current location, the Blake House sat on a 10-acre parcel of farmland a few hundred feet to the northwest. This original site today is a parking lot of an electrical utility company across from a shopping center. And as the city archaeologist, I cannot explain how much I would like to survey that parking lot for the original location of the 1660s Blake House. So James Blake and his wife Elizabeth Clapp had this house made for them in 1661 on their relatively modest lot. Many owners at the time had significantly larger lots than 10 acres. At 32 by 20 feet, it's nearly 1,500 square foot of interior space across 4 rooms on 2 floors on either side of a central fireplace was quite large for its time. Many houses at this time were built quite small, often with rooms only on one side of the fireplace when they were first built, then expanding to the opposite side of the fireplace to form a symmetrical facade with a central entrance and fireplace. This house began its story in the overall size and shape shown here. So in many ways, this was quite a mansion for the 1660s. Also different from many other buildings of this period was the style of its construction. Architectural historians believe that the house wrights, the people who actually built the house, were from the southwest corner of England, where trees were far more prevalent. This resulted in a distinct regional building style that uses large and numerous timbers in the construction of the home. These details are found in the Blake House as well, and you can see them on the upper and the right hand image in black and white. These are details of the framing of the building itself. Most of the English house wrights and other immigrants to New England in the 17th century were from East Anglia. This region northeast, this is the region northeast of London. Here, the overall lack of trees meant that these architects used smaller and fewer timbers in their framing. So most other 17th century houses in Massachusetts reflect an East Anglian style of architecture. In fact, the Blake House is the older of only 2 surviving, quote, West of England style 17th century houses in Massachusetts, the other being the circa 1678 Coffin House in Newbury, Massachusetts, north of Boston, which is shown on the lower left-hand corner. So moving from the theme of old, we're going to go to the theme of interconnectedness. So one of the more remarkable aspects of the research of this book that I conducted was how intertwined the stories of these buildings were, given that the 50 buildings included in this book represent a minuscule percentage of the total buildings that exist or have existed in Boston. So overall, the scope of the book is the 50 oldest buildings, numbered from the from the oldest to the youngest of the 50, and they all predate 1795. But we're going to skip around the book throughout this presentation to kind of talk about the various themes. So at some points during the research of this book, Boston very much felt like a very small town with the same cast of characters constantly reappearing. So these are a few highlights of the surprising connections that turned up during the writing process, featuring 3 of the houses in the book. So the Shirley Eustis house is the 19th oldest building in Boston and located in the Roxbury neighborhood. It was built on a small hill overlooking a nearby bay and once rural outskirts of Roxbury. Today, the home is surrounded by a dense multifamily homes in one of Boston's historically Black neighborhoods, a notable fact considering that Governor Shirley ordered the 1754 slave census of Massachusetts that recorded 2,720 enslaved people, including Shirley's own enslaved people, who lived in the basement of this house. Not 2,700 people, but Shirley's enslaved people lived in the house. In 1746, workers began the 5-year construction of William Shirley's country mansion during the first of his 2 terms in the 1740s and 1750s as governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay. Shirley's new home was meant to impress, and it was likely designed by the architect Peter Harrison, who added sanded paint and carved elements to the home's design exterior to make it look as though it was carved from stone. Governor Shirley attended church at King's Chapel, the 21st oldest building in Boston. King's Chapel began its history as a small wooden church in the corner of Boston's First Cemetery. The original wood church was expanded in 1710. However, it soon outgrew its footprint, requiring the purchase of land from the town of Boston, which owned the surrounding cemetery and the nearby Boston Latin School. After much outcry over the need to demolish the Boston Latin School, the expansion plans were ultimately successful, and the congregation purchased the lot of land behind the building, purchased another lot on the opposite side of the street to build a new Boston Latin School property. The new church was designed by Peter Harrison, the same person that designed the Shirley Eustis house. It probably did not hurt his cause that he had recently finished the building of the governor and fellow congregants' home. Now, a few miles down the road in 1755, the merchant John Gould paid for the construction of a large home for his daughter, Sarah, and her future husband, the Reverend John Troutback, on a large parcel of what would later be known as the Jamaica Plain neighborhood in Boston. This is now known as the Linden Hall, the 23rd oldest building in Boston. So Troutback was an assistant rector of King's Chapel. He also was a rum distiller, a profession frowned upon by some members of the community, including the author of the following poem. This is a period poem from the late 18th century. John of small spirit, who deals in the spirit, as next in course I sing. Sorry, I'm gonna start over. John of small merit, who deals in the spirit, as next in course I sing. Fain would I treat, as is most meet, this chaplain of the king. His Sunday aim is to reclaim those that in vice are sunk. When Mondays come, he selleth rum and gets them plaguey drunk. So he wasn't the most popular person amongst the more teetotaling residents of Boston. Another thing I wanted to reflect on very briefly before we move on to the next building is how not only are all these 3 buildings interconnected in their histories, they also are remarkably close to each other in the actual listings in the book, number 19, 21, and 23. I was really shocked while writing this how buildings that had connections to each other were also of similar dates, mostly because of the people that were involved. But there seems to be a Charlestown section of the book, a Dorchester section of the book, a downtown section of the book. And that just kind of inherently happened as the book was being written. And that was something I was quite shocked by as I was going through it. So one of the other stories I wanted to share is a more narrative version of one of the buildings that I feature in the book, building number 36, the Elijah Jones house, built around 1786 in the Mattapan neighborhood of Boston. So for those of you that are not from the Boston area, many people don't know about the Mattapan neighborhood. It's actually the southernmost neighborhood of Boston, kind of southern and central part. I show a map on the right showing the exact location of the 3 Marcy Road in Mattapan. And you'll note the Neponset River flowing at the southern end of the city of Boston. So one of my favorite aspects of the book are the buildings that have been hiding in plain sight. And I definitely think that the 36th oldest building in Boston is one of the more surprising examples of hidden histories and hidden connections. So in March of 1777, during the Revolution, the housewright Elijah Jones purchased 1 3/4 acres of undeveloped pasture near the Neponset River at the southern end of what would later be Boston's Mattapan neighborhood. Elijah Jones's house that he built is modest in scale with a gambrel roof and standing just 1.5 stories tall. It had a central doorway with 3 probably not original window openings in its gambrel roof and currently has a central chimney that almost certainly has been greatly reduced in size. The mills immediately to the south of this house on the Neponset River included the paper-making factory of Hugh Mclean, an Irish immigrant, 18th century Irish immigrant, and his business partner, James Boyes. Mclean purchased both of the properties from both of the house lots that Jones owned in 1786. The house at this time likely functioned as a small rental unit for mill workers or was a store. We know that both a house and a store were on the properties, but we're not sure if this house was the home or the store remodeled later into a home. John Mclean was a wealthy Boston merchant, and upon his death in 1823, he left his wife, Anne, their massive Bullfinch-designed house in downtown Boston and a salary of funds of $35,000. Here's the things that are going to take a bit of a turn. Mclean gave Harvard University money to fund a named chair, the Mclean Professor of Ancient and Modern History. The chair is currently occupied by Emma Dench, a Roman historian and Dame Judi Dench's niece. So for any of you that thought we were going to discuss Dame Judi Dench tonight, I hope that at least that was somewhat surprising. John Mclean's will gave over $100,000 to the Massachusetts General Hospital. He also gave the Elijah Jones house and shop to his business partner's son, John Boys, the son of James Boys. Boys had unfortunately died, so the Jones house instead was turned over to Mass General Hospital. The hospital was now the owner of a tiny house in Mattapan and had absolutely no use for it, so it decided to sell it in 1824 to Amasa Fuller, who was another paper maker. Many of the people that we encounter in the book in the Mattapan-Dorchester neighborhood are paper makers, because on the Neponset River, the river was a hub of paper making factories going back to the 1700s. So continuing the story with the Mass General Hospital, Mclean's gift to MGH, which now included the sale of the Elijah Jones house, so the money from the Elijah Jones house, went to Mass General Hospital's Asylum for the Insane, which was renamed in 1826 the Mclean Asylum for the Insane following his gift. Today, the Mclean Hospital, a facility in Belmont, Massachusetts, is a world-renowned psychiatric hospital and ranked #1 in the United States for psychiatric care. And part of that reason that it exists is a tiny little house in Mattapan. So this book also celebrates the preservation and efforts that go into bringing back buildings from the brink of destruction. So we're going to leap over the Charles River to the Charlestown neighborhood, where there's a cluster of old buildings at the end of the book which reflect the rapid redevelopment of Charlestown after the neighborhood was burned by British troops during the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 1775. So after the battle, the people of Charlestown returned to their city to rebuild. In 1780, John Leach drew a, quote, plan of the new streets of Charlestown with the alterations of the old. It was the first map drawn of Charlestown after it began to rebuild. In it, he provides the first documentation of the existence of the Warren Tavern, Charlestown's first post-war tavern. It was built by Eliphalet Newell, a local baker and Freemason, and an officer in the Massachusetts Artillery from 1775 to 1777. Taverns, also called ordinaries, were common fixtures of a community and were places where one could find food and beverage. Most also rented rooms for travelers and were meeting places for community members. In 1899, the elevated railroad entered Charlestown, which you can see in the foreground of the image on the tavern on the right. It created a massive iron structure and eyesore along Main Street and greatly affected the view and value of many historic homes and businesses along the road. The Warren Tavern was used for commercial purposes, including a private club, after it was a tavern, as a private club, a bakery, and a storage warehouse. By the 1960s, it had been abandoned and boarded up. In 1971, James River Adams began a full restoration of the Warren Tavern as part of a years-long restoration project involving 5 nearby historic properties, including buildings number 43, 45, 46, and 47. Again, there's a big cluster of Charlestown buildings at the end of the book. In 1972, Alan and Ann Kuna and Neil and Ed Grennan purchased the property and reopened the Warren Tavern to the public. So in the theme of restoration and preservation, I want to kind of end with some thoughts on demolition. So this is actually where I begin the book, but it's a timely, relevant thing for today and this week, about how we can transform loss into action. And that's one of the themes that comes up in the book, and how we lose things and use that as a leveraging point to make things better. So on the right is the Hancock Manor. It's a 1735 mansion built for Thomas Hancock that was later transferred to the ownership of John Hancock of Revolutionary fame. So at Hancock's death, he intended to have the house transfer over to the Commonwealth, but that sale fell through, and it was eventually sold at auction in 1863. The new owners wanted to build 2 row houses along the Boston Common, and offered to give the house away for free if the house was moved. That failed, and it was slated for demolition, which triggered the broadside on June 6, 1863, begging Bostonians to please act to fundraise and move to protect the Hancock House. Ultimately, it failed, but we can cite the loss of the John Hancock House in 1863 as the event that sparked the preservation movement in New England. But that movement was very soon tested. So in 1872, a few years after the loss of the Hancock Manor, we had what's known as the Great Fire of Boston. And you can see in the central photograph the devastation that was caused by the fire and how close it came to Old South Meeting House. Essentially, everything in the path of the fire is gone, and it ended with the last building of Old South. And at the same time of the fire, the people of Boston rallied to save Old South by placing wet blankets on its roof and spraying it down with hoses for water to stop it from being lost. But just 2 years later, in 1874, the congregation of Old South moved to Back Bay into what is now called New Old South. And they sold the building for scrap in June of 1876 and gave the new owners 60 days to demolish the building. That caused a rally and outcry in that same year in 1876 to try to preserve Old South Meeting House. And I'm going to have the next slide is going to show some of the details of billboards essentially that were placed on the outside of the building. So a clothing merchant and his son bought the rights to stop the demolition for 7 days. During a massive meeting with many speakers and large crowds, they were able to raise $420,000 to save the building, but that was not enough. Ultimately, the Old South Meeting House was saved by a group of 20 Boston women who formed the Old South Association, which still exists, raised or borrowed money for purchasing the building and the land under it in October 1876, and saved the building. This represents the first time an historic building in New England was saved for the purpose of preservation, strictly for the history that it is contained and housed within the walls and the physical presence of this building. So why is that relevant today? So this book only came out maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago. If you have the book, turn to page, I can't remember what it is, but it's building number 41, which is the Calvin Bird House. It was built around 1790. It's on the northern end of Dorchester. I found out during my presentation in the Dorchester Historical Society that this building was slated for demolition. Now, it had already gone through apparently the process for demolition delay and all of the hearings for landmarking back in 2018, I believe. But sadly, over last weekend, just a couple of days ago, the 41st oldest house in Boston, the Calvin Bird House, built in 1790 or so, was torn down for a new condo building. Now, the building was likely not going to be landmark eligible based on its appearance and its historic character. Basically, it would have been really hard to get that above a local significance. However, as a thematic district or as a thematic preservation of the 50 oldest buildings in Boston, it's likely that this building could have been buoyed by its presence on this list to help save it. So sadly, even though it was done completely by the book and they followed all of the rules, ultimately we have lost the 41st oldest house in Boston over the weekend, the Calvin Bird House. Admittedly, not one of the more attractive buildings on the list, but that doesn't matter. We're not about saving the nicest looking houses, because there's a lot of ways that builds in a lot of problems with history and discrimination and the lack of representative history by only preserving the largest, the nicest, the oldest buildings that are remaining. So I'm just going to leave you all with the general question that maybe I should be answering, but I want to kind of ask generally as well. Should all of these buildings be saved just inherently? We've already lost one, but what about the rest of them? Does their mere presence and their mere age make them historically significant and make them something that Boston, city of Boston, should save? So that's my brief presentation, and I'm hoping you guys all have questions that we can answer together. And I'm gonna stop my share screen now.
Wow. Gosh, Joe, thank you so much. I have to say, it makes me so proud to live in Boston and to live in Massachusetts. And you very modestly said that the loss of the Hancock Mansion was the beginning of the preservation movement in New England. I, of course, am going to be much more bold than you, because I think it's the beginning of the preservation movement in the United States.
Mm.
And, so much, it's like the loss of Penn Station in New York. You have to have a sacrificial lamb before other people stand up and say, this can't happen again. And that's what we saw with Old South. And I think, like so many things, everything that's good in America started in New England. I might give a small exception to Philadelphia, my native town, but there's just so much here to unpack. And I think something that I really want to emphasize that I don't think most of us realize is something you touched upon at the very beginning, which is that if you are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or you are a National Historic Landmark, a designation, both those designations given by the federal government, and they sound very grand, and they take a lot of time, sometimes years to get approved, lots of money and lawyers, then they give you virtually no protection at all. It's a nice plaque you can put out, you can brag about it, you can help to get something in your local town listed to preserve. But I think the key thing to take away from everything that you said is that what keeps a building from being demolished or destroyed or altered beyond recognition are local communities like in the Back Bay here in Boston or in Beacon Hill, where you have local districts who very strictly enforce the integrity of historic buildings. And what I'd like to ask you is, how do you see that throughout the United States today? What is the state of historic preservation in America today?
So I think overall, the state is trending towards a much more inclusive historic preservation, which is excellent. I think when you look at what has been preserved, what has been landmark designated, going back to the 60s and the 70s, when that really started to get a lot of steam from urban renewal activities and large highway projects, that there was still this trend towards the prettiest, the largest, the oldest buildings being preserved. And honestly, in Boston, we see that on Beacon Hill and Back Bay. And what we've lost in a lot of those places is the underrepresented, the missing stories, and the histories that have been suppressed over time. And I see in historic preservation this real pivot towards really trying to find those stories and make sure that those stories are being added to the preservation movement. But because those are not only the most not only the hardest ones, frankly, to find, but they're actually the most at risk of being lost immediately, because those stories are not necessarily appreciated as much as they could be.
Something that I think people might be surprised to find in your book, I was surprised and delighted, is Boston Light, which is, for our audience, a lighthouse in Boston Harbor that was 1716. And one of the things I took away from it that I was particularly impressed by is it is the only lighthouse in the United States that is still manned. As a matter of fact, I love the woman's name, Sally Snowman, is the lighthouse keeper. And that by itself is amazing. But what I'm worried about, and you end on this in the entry, is that the General Services Administration, who owns it, has said they want to get rid of it. So what does that mean for something like that?
So right now it is a National Historic Landmark, but as we agreed, that doesn't have a lot of teeth. It is in a National Register district as well, but there is no fundamental historic preservation restrictions on Boston Light Station. So that means that it can be radically changed over time. So this may be the best opportunity right now to say, let's get this designated so that we can make sure that a clearly nationally significant building has that level of preservation restrictions on it, so that we can actually preserve these buildings. One of the nice things about National Historic Landmark, even though doesn't have a lot of teeth, it's designates it as a nationally significant building, and that should make it really easy to make a landmark, because places like Paul Revere House, King's Chapel, these are places that are National Historic Landmarks but are not landmark designated. But the groundwork has been done. We already have the significant statements written down through the National Register, and that exists for Boston Light Station. It was a very easy chapter to write because it's all written out already. I'm just synthesizing data. But we still need that extra level of protections in order to protect it. And who knows where the future of this is going to be for that particular building, the lighthouse. But I'm hoping that there will be some restrictions placed on the transfer when it happens that include historic preservation.
So does that mean you think it will continue to be a manned lighthouse? I'm assuming the federal government doesn't want it anymore, but it still has a practical use as a lighthouse.
I don't know about that. I know that there's other lighthouses in Boston Harbor that are actually privately owned that are still functioning as lighthouses that have been turned into homes and been taken pretty good care of. But that's not a guarantee, you know? And so in many ways, we have a lot of GPS navigation technology that you don't need to lighthouse as much. We are less likely this now to have boats crashing into the Brewsters. But yeah, I mean, I think that part of its historic significance is its function as a lighthouse, and that should be maintained.
I couldn't agree more. I'm actually looking at our question and answer screen, and there are a number of questions that are coming in. People asking about the division, which I know is going to be hard to do off the top of your head, of the books, of the items in your book, the houses, I shouldn't say houses, the buildings, and the division between government owned, privately owned, and let's say religious. Would you be able to hazard a guess on the breakdown of what that might be?
Sure. I would say that about, I think there's 4 churches in the book, maybe 3, that are nonprofit museums that also function as churches as well. The government doesn't own very many of these buildings. I believe the city of Boston owns officially Faneuil Hall and the Old State House, although it's the Old State House is managed by the Bostonian Society or historic spaces. The vast majority of the buildings in this book, though, are privately owned buildings. Many of the people who are living in them may actually have woken up in April and found their house in a book about the 50 oldest buildings in Boston and had no idea that they were living in the oldest house in Boston, some of the oldest houses in Boston. I know that some of the research that went into this book was my original research. So I think at the point that I published it, nobody else knew about it other than my editors. So hopefully it was a bit of a surprise for some of these folks. But I didn't pick or choose the buildings exclusively except for date. That was the only parameter that I went by.
Well, I think that's very egalitarian and very fair. Actually, since you mentioned Faneuil Hall, we have a number of people who've asked about Faneuil Hall and about the Union Oyster House. And I know the latter is in the book. I don't remember Faneuil Hall. Is Faneuil Hall in the book? I don't remember seeing it.
Yeah, I don't remember which number. I think it's 10, 15, something around there.
So could you just talk a little bit about both of those? Because I think particularly for tourists and because they're so close to each other, those are interesting points.
Sure. So Faneuil Hall, for me, the part that I think is always fascinating about Faneuil Hall is that what you're seeing is the second Faneuil Hall that was there. There was a smaller mini Faneuil Hall that was there, and the 2 of the walls of the original Faneuil Hall still remain, and it was expanded in 2 directions. And you can I do an outline in the book of where exactly in the walls the original building actually was, because those parts are still there to make it the actual oldest building in Boston, or one of the oldest buildings in Boston, because the addition happened in the 1800s. The Union Oyster House, which is located just down the street, really, and you can practically see them from each other's front doors. For me, the part that really was fascinating was the widening of a street. I think it's I can't remember the name of the street, but the street that's in front of the Union Oyster House actually caused the corner of the building to be cut off completely. So when you look at the Union Oyster House, it has this funny bend in it. That wasn't a rich. They sliced off the front of the building and rebuilt the facade going up. They did a good job because you couldn't tell that it was not historic. But both of those buildings are old, but they both have fundamentally been altered over time. And I think that's kind of the story that comes up in a lot of these books, is that what you're seeing is a carefully restored version of what it used to look like. And since historic preservation has really evolved over time, we have a better understanding of how these things should have looked. And that's been now restored back to original appearances. But if you go back 50 years for most of these houses and buildings and structures, they were not looking terribly good. And I showed the Warren Tavern. That was not rare, especially in Charlestown, to see these buildings in really rough shape and now restored back to their full glory.
Well, since you actually mentioned that, one of the questions that we've had come up is, how do you determine the age of the building? If you don't have written records, and especially what you're just talking about, which is so common, I think, throughout the world, which is a very old building that's been altered, added to, demolished, added to again, renovated. How do you come up with the date that you called the original building?
Sure. So the worst way to do it is to go by architectural style, because we could build a 16th century or 17th century looking house today. That is somewhat something that you have to rely on in some of these cases, but some people liked older styles in the 18th century and used an older style house. What I fundamentally relied on for dating a structure were deeds. And I would go to the deeds. I think over half of these buildings, I did original deed research. And what I was looking for was a deed, one deed that said I bought a parcel of land, and that's it. And then the following deed that said I'm selling a parcel of land with a house, telling me that we go from a vacant lot to a current building. Now the $64 question is that the same house that's still standing? So I'd have to do a lot of research on architectural styles and like looking at probate records to see if they mention in like 30 years later that they have a new house, which probably rules it out as being a 30-year-old house at that time. But that's really what it fundamentally boiled down to, was the presence or absence of the mention of a house in the deed of the property. And if I was lucky, that was a short period of time. If I was really unlucky, it was a much longer period of time. The other thing that I did a lot was I was very fortunate that many of the buildings that had these long ownership periods were built or were owned by house rights. So I made a logical leap to say, if a house right bought a lot of land in say 1785 and then sold it in 1790, I doubt they sat on it for 5 years as a vacant lot as a professional home builder. They likely bought it to build a house on it so that they could either own it for themselves or sell it as an investment. So a lot of the dates in the book are approximate dates, and that's usually based on the ownership history and the who's buying the house. Quite a few of the buildings in the book were actually built by were owned by Masons or house rights as the first owner, which was really convenient.
That's wicked interesting. Following on that, what would you say in putting together this book was your most exciting and surprising discovery?
There was a house in Dorchester, at the northern end of Dorchester, that I started reading about, and there's a guy named William Cranch Bond who appears out of nowhere, buys the house. He doesn't live there, but he owns it as a rental property. And I'm like, well, who's this William Cranch Bond person? I put it into Google, and it like explodes with all of these different things about him. Ultimately, he was an amateur astronomer that got really into observing space and built an astronomy telescope in his house in Dorchester, which was just down the street from the one that I was studying, with a retractable roof and everything. This is in the early 1800s.
Wow.
Harvard got really interested in it, bought all of his equipment, hired him to be the first astronomer for Harvard. And then William Cranch Bond and his son ended up finding all kinds of like moons on Saturn. And there's a crater, a big crater on the moon named after William Cranch Bond, this guy who owned this house in Dorchester and a Dorchester resident. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, my wife is really into astronomy, and I was just like, I'm looking up stuff about the moon right now. And then like all of these random things that are coming up during the research. I'm like, I didn't think I'd be looking up craters on the moon when I was writing this book, but here we are.
That is so cool. And actually, one question leads to another. This is what's so wonderful and organic about all this. We have a number of questions from viewers asking what effect tourism has on historic buildings. And I'm assuming that could mean the positive and the negative.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, we have a lot of historic house museums that are solely providing for the preservation of these houses by tourist dollars. And look at the Freedom Trail. Many of the buildings that survive downtown are financially supported by tourism. There's no question about it. But I think that what you see on the outskirts of the city is not a lack of tourism, but certainly nobody's going to Mattapan and Alston Brighton to look at old houses. That's just not happening. And there we're seeing preservation happening almost exclusively because these buildings didn't get in the way of the changes of the neighborhoods. They weren't too big, they weren't too small, they weren't in the middle of a gigantic lot that now is standing with 57 condos. They just happened to kind of fit for their entire history. And a lot of them just frankly snuck under the radar. They weren't necessarily even saved because they were historic. They just fit, and nobody remembered to tear them down, essentially. And that's kind of the Elijah Jones house. I looked at that. I was like, why is this house still here? But I think that we have historic tourism to thank for many of the preserved buildings downtown. And certainly as the city has evolved as a tourist destination, we're seeing places like Charlestown really investing in the buildings there. After we took down the raised highway during the Big Dig, many of those buildings down Main Street, which were completely blocked by this raised rusting highway, it opened them back up to being a destination really for tourists. And now people are going into Charlestown because of its historic preservation and its beauty, to look at the old buildings there. And people are investing in the buildings and the economy of downtown Charlestown, because it's a beautiful place with these old historic buildings. And it's frankly the brand of Boston. Boston exists and is supported by tourism. It's one of our biggest industries, if not the biggest industries. We need tourism, and people aren't coming here to watch baseball. They're not coming here to go to our art museums. Those are all important. They're coming here to see the old buildings that make Boston, Boston.
You speak of Charlestown, and one of the things I was shocked by in the book, and for those of you who don't have the book yet, Joe gives a map in the beginning of the areas of Boston with the dots where the 50 buildings are. It was astonishing to me how many are in Charlestown, because Charlestown is so small. Charlestown originally being a separate town, but of course now a part of Boston. And it's still, its footprint is still very small. And it's amazing that this place is such a density of the oldest buildings in Boston. And it just sort of blows my mind. And I can probably answer this question myself, but I can't because I don't know. But someone has asked if any of the original 50 buildings are owned by the families who owned them when they were built.
I do not believe that's the case.
I mean, what I would say this is not England, where that would be very common. Americans just don't keep homes more than 2 or 3 generations, in my experience. It just isn't done. It's just, we don't have that kind of history here. Go ahead.
The closest thing we've got is the Pierce House in Dorchester. It's the second oldest building in Boston, 17th century. It was owned by the Pierce family from the moment it was built until I think the 1960s or 1970s, when it was turned over to Faneuil, which is now Historic New England, who owns it as a house museum. So they're the second owner of the second oldest house in Boston.
And that's pretty amazing. Going as late as the 1960s is a hell of a story in an American house. Something else that I think we have to give a plug for is that that would be wonderful, Joe, is going to be doing a tour for us on August 12th. And one of the things that I can dovetail into that statement and promo is how many of these places would you guess out of the 50 are open to the public?
Well, all of them you can walk up to, which I did gleefully with my camera, getting ready for the photo. Most of the ones on the Freedom Trail are museums or museum adjacent. So the downtown buildings absolutely are places you can go into and see. I think almost all of them downtown are. A couple of the Grant House on Hanover Street. If you've been to Boston and you've eaten on Hanover Street, our Italian food mecca, you've been on Hanover Street. There's a house hiding in the back end of it. That's an 18th century house that you can get your hair cut in, but it's in the front part of the building. So there's a variety of kind of public at this point, but quite a few of the downtown ones are accessible and you can walk into. A lot of the ones in Charlestown have businesses on their first floors and you can go to them in that way. But most of the buildings on the outskirts are still private homes.
We have a number of people who actually ask about what is restricted in an historic house. So the way one of these questions was posed is that somebody buys a house and doesn't realize that it is in historic district and then tries to change it. What I have to say, honestly, I find that pretty unlikely, because I think in the course of the sale of the house, it's almost required, if there are easements and things, that it be part of the deed. But what kind of remodeling issues would you say? And I'd say again to everybody, this is just in very specific parts of Boston, back to the Back Bay again, and Beacon Hill. Most of these houses that sadly are in Joe's book are not protected at all.
Yeah, only 6 of the buildings in the book are landmark designated out of 50. So the restrictions that are on the property are entirely dependent on the history of the property and what makes them historically significant. So part of the landmarking process is a writing phase that is called the standards and criteria. And basically it's a list of the architecturally significant aspects of the house that either must be restored or kept. So everything that's being done, you basically get a list of your rules as the owner of the property. And if you conform to the rules, you're fine. And the rules have some flexibility within them. They're not necessarily defining the only color something can be, but a range of colors that something can be. And I can totally understand people bristling at that restrictions on their kind of, private home ownership. But at the same time, it's the thing that helps maintain the value of these homes. It's the thing that helps maintain the character of the city, and the kind of retail cost of these places, for better or worse, because they also make them fairly exclusive neighborhoods as well. And there's problems with that. But fundamentally, each one of these landmark designations have a list of the specific things about the house. And if it's an individual landmark, like we're working on landmarking the Shirley Eustis house, we will go element by element to say the balustrade has to look like that balustrade. It might blow off in a hurricane, it might get blown up, but at some point you have to put back a balustrade that looks like that balustrade, and it can't be plastic, it has to be wood to be authentic to the form of the house. Or if you're restoring a house, it has to be using period materials, it has to be using period design. But we also have the opposite of that, which is if you're going to add an addition to an historic property, that addition can't look like the historic property. It has to look like the period of when it was added, because we don't want to confuse people down the road to say, oh, that's part of an 18th century house. No, an addition to an 18th century house should look like it was built in 2021. And we will actually regulate folks to not make it look 18th century.
That's interesting. I bet you a lot of people who own a historic house who wanted to put an addition on it would be really pissed off by that, because they want it to look the same.
Right.
And actually, I have to say, as an aside, I still cannot believe that the Shirley Eustis house is not landmarked by the city. That just is a crime.
I'm working on it.
I know. No, I'm not. This is not directed at you. It's just.
I know.
These are decades of inaction. We are coming to the end, but one of the things that I think it's important to remind people is that so much of Boston is filled land. Depending on how you mark it, could be up to 40% of what we call Boston today is filled land. That's actually land that was originally water. And one of the questions that come up is about East Boston. East Boston is almost entirely fill. It's not that old. It's where the airport is. And I thought you might just mention something about the oldest parts of Boston and how we added to Boston through fill over the years.
Sure. Yeah. I was a little sad not to see every neighborhood represented in the book. I really wanted to have even more neighborhoods. I think we have 10 neighborhoods covered in the book. But the reality is Boston is a tiny, tiny, tiny space. The original land of Boston is, I think, a little bit bigger than Franklin Park, for those of you that know Boston, which is a big park.
Really? Was it really that?
Wow. It was a tiny little peninsula, and we've added and added and added, not just by making land, but we've kind of globbed on other neighborhoods. So Brighton and Allston, Roxbury, Dorchester, all these places that are kind of the outskirts of Boston as a city, those were added on and annexed to the city. But yeah, we ran out of land really quickly. And as early as the 1600s, we were adding land. So Faneuil Hall, which many people who've been to Boston have been to, Faneuil Hall is standing on land that wasn't there in 1630. They filled in part of a dock in order to make enough room to build Faneuil Hall, because when Faneuil Hall was built in 1713 or whatever it was, there was no more room to put it. We had to make land in order to put Faneuil Hall up. That makes it extremely vulnerable now, because back in the 1700s, we filled up land to a couple feet above high tide, which is now not a couple feet above high tide. So those are also the most vulnerable areas of the city, the low-lying filled-in areas. But yeah, we have added an incredible amount of land to Boston.
One of the things I think is really interesting about Faneuil Hall, for those of who live here, we think of the fill as primarily a 19th century thing, which it was. The Back Bay was created in the 19th century, and as was the South End. But it's gone on since the beginning. And one of the things I think it's important to remember as well is that Beacon Hill was once twice as tall as it is now. They took half of it down to fill in the Back Bay. And there's a street here called Tremont Street, which originally stood for Tri Mountain, because it originally were three mountains. They weren't mountains, they were hills. Pemberton, Beacon, I forget what the third one was.
Mount Vernon.
Thank you very much. Mount Vernon. So the other two are completely gone. They kept Beacon Hill only because it was historically important because of the Revolution. Those were all used to fill in. And the other thing that's really bad about this is that Boston lies underneath the second most active fault in America. And the worst place to be in an earthquake is on filled land, because it's like jello. So we're living on a ticking time bomb here, folks. You got to come and visit soon. And with that, I am going to officially bow out and thank Joe for an amazing presentation that's gotten me even more excited about Boston than I thought I could possibly be.
Well, thanks so much, Kurt.
Thank you so much. You gentlemen took us on a really wonderful historical tour. And we really enjoyed it. You've given us places to go and so much food for thought and advocacy to do. There's a lot of work to do. I live in Brookline, and we've had a very devastating 24 hours with a certain landmark commission. So we look to you, Joe. We're so grateful. And as we do for all of our American Inspiration author events, we're asking Joe to do a brief reading, a reflection, a call to action. Joe, whatever you'd like for us to think about in closing, back to you.
Well, thanks so much. So I'm going to actually read a quote from a speech that was given at Old South Meeting House by Reverend H. Murray in 1876. So the photo I showed of the placards on the outside of Old South begging people to save the building. So this is it's a little bit redacted, but this is some of what Reverend H. Murray said that night. What is it that makes Boston? Do your warehouses make Boston? Do your stores make Boston? Do your miles of wharfage make Boston? Do the white sails of your many ships make Boston? Are these the things that make Boston and are chiefly valuable to it? No. These warehouses, these ships, these mansions, these things of iron and wood and stone are only the body of Boston, are only the iron nerves along which her interior, unseen, vital self communicates her will. They're only the flesh in which she is living. But Boston is that unseen something, that immortal, sublime, invisible spirit that is not in this building or that building, but which buildings suggest and advertise to the public. And here in this building, there's value beyond any material valuation, because here Boston has her unseen, invisible, loftiest self suggested and expressed to the public. Can you afford to let that which is so sweet, that which is so sacred, that which is so sublime a power pass away? Take away these expressions of the soul, of the life of Boston, and what, I ask, have you left beyond any other city on the continent?
Such beautiful words. In addition to sort of a meditation and a rallying cry, that's really an ode to Boston. And to the preservation movement, and to really the good work that so many of you are doing, Joe, you and your team, and Kurt through what he does. Thank you so much. We really loved seeing your images, and we loved hearing from both of you. What a great night. Just a reminder, if you enjoyed tonight, signed copies, personalized copies of Boston's oldest buildings can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge. Again, use the coupon code AMINSP20 as you order online, and they'll waive the shipping fee for media mail. Put a special name or a few words in the order comments box, and the book will come to you personalized for a happy Father's Day, graduation, and the like. This is a great gift, and even better for your collection, perhaps, of travel books and history books. What's even more exciting, and Kurt referred to it, is if you're a Boston sorter coming to town, do think to join us on August 12th for an in-person walking tour with Joe and Kurt. They'll be viewing many of the buildings in Joe's book, going back through Boston's Back Bay and going up and over Beacon Hill. Check back soon for more information on AmericanAncestors.org, or if you opted into hearing from us as you registered tonight, we'll send you information. So look for an email and some links there. The registration will be there, and save August 12th. If you get your book in advance, you could be the star student. Registration will open soon, and it will be limited. Now, Beth has more to share from the State Library. Beth, back to you.
Thank you. And thank you to Kurt, and especially to Joe. I think, like Kurt, I'm newly re-excited about the history of Boston, and I'm ready to head out and find all of the books in your book, or at least 49 of them. I hope both of you and all of our attendees tonight will feel welcome to visit the State Library. We're right in the Massachusetts State House, and you could visit us after we reopen. In the meantime, we invite all of our viewers today to start with our website to learn about our resources, our services, and our great collections. You can type in a simple version of our URL, mass.gov/LIB. That will take you right to our homepage, as you can see here. You'll see on this very brief introductory slide that our collections cover a wide variety of topics and formats, though most of our holdings document the history of Massachusetts and its government. We have a large amount of material relating to buildings, architecture, and land planning in the Commonwealth, and much of that is available in our digital repository. So we've put chat links to the resources that are most relevant to tonight's presentation, including an exhibit we did not too long ago on the history of the current Massachusetts State House. So please do check out those links. And you're welcome to contact us for help with any of your research questions. We're working from home right now and are happy to help you as much as we can from home. And then when we reopen, we'll have even better help for your research. So you can see on the next slide that we have 2 events coming up that cover very different aspects of Massachusetts than our talk tonight. So on Tuesday, July 27th, we have, in partnership with the Boston Public Library and American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society, The Agitators, 3 friends who fought for abolition and women's rights. And that's by Dorothy Wickenden, who is the executive editor of The New Yorker and the host of The New Yorker's weekly podcast, Politics and More. And just so you know, one of those 3 friends is Harriet Tubman. So it's a really interesting book. Then in August, on Tuesday, August 17th, like tonight, in collaboration with our colleagues at American Ancestors, we'll host Scott Borchert on his new book, Republic of Detours, How the New Deal Paid Broke Writers to Rediscover America. And we're hoping he concentrates on Massachusetts for that particular talk. The publisher describes this book as an immersive account of the New Deal project that created state-by-state guidebooks to America in the midst of the Great Depression and employed some of the biggest names in American letters. So I hope you'll be able to join us for both of these events. And thank you again to everyone. And we're back to Margaret for our final announcements.
Beth, thank you so much. We at American Ancestors NEHGS are delighted to have presented tonight's event with you. If you're researching a city such as Boston in New England or anywhere, or you are researching your family through time, you might find our library and education center to be useful. Our stacks on Newbury Street are opening very soon for appointments, or you can visit our digital archives anytime. You can connect with our genealogists or join in an educational program from our Brew Family Learning Center. All of this online through americanancestors.org. Among our many webinars and programs, on June 16, Kurt will be leading a virtual tour of country houses in Shropshire, England. And before that, on June 10 online, we're looking at how best to research the Old South. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and connect. And in the American Inspiration Author Series, Beth mentioned a few events. Between now and then, we're presenting also some other authors. On June 15, we'll be hearing from journalist Gabrielle Glazer about her book, American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. She'll be joined by WBUR broadcast journalist Peter O'Dowd. Together, they'll look back at America's baby boom and its impact on families today. I can't say much more, but this night will be full of surprises. Back to colonial history, on June 28, we're welcoming the best-loved Canadian historian, Stephen R. Bone, with his history of Canada's origins and the Hudson's Bay Company. He'll be in dialogue with Jeff Breithaupt, the Canadian-born songwriter, author, and podcaster now living in New York City. With them, we'll celebrate Canada Day a few days early. And on July 8, just a couple days after the 4th, we'll be exploring America's history with journalist Peter S. Canalos, previously the editorial page director at the Globe, and Carlo Rotella, professor of American Studies and English at Boston College. They'll take us back to America's Gilded Age and the good works of Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan and his forward-thinking dissenting opinions. We'll look at what got stopped and what progress was made in sustaining our country as the land of the free and the home of the brave during the Gilded Age. It was a very complicated time. So, okay, back to Boston, and tonight, truly winding down, Joe and Kurt, we thank you for this great evening of urban history and insight. To all our audience, thank you for your interest and your questions from all over the country. We wish all of you at home a good evening and a sunny, inspirational days ahead. From the presenters and from the production team all across Boston tonight, we wish you a very good night. Thank you.